I never imagined that a night shift could feel like stepping into another dimension. The city outside was silent, lights flickering in the distance. But inside the abandoned research lab, the air felt thick and wrong. You could almost taste the remnants of experiments long forgotten, chemicals that shouldn't have lasted this long, faint odors of antiseptics, and something darker beneath it all. As I walked through the metal doors, I felt eyes on me, even though the place had been empty for years. If you're watching this, comment below where you're watching from, city, country. I want to know who else is awake while the world sleeps. I've been a night shift security officer for years, but nothing prepared me for this. The hum of dormant machines, the occasional flicker of lights, the eerie way shadows pooled in corners. It was as if the building itself was alive, waiting, watching. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been left behind here wasn't content to rest quietly.
I had never seen the inside of the laboratory before that night. Even the thought of walking through its rusted doors made my stomach twist. They called me in at the last minute, a replacement for the regular night guard who apparently couldn't handle it. I shrugged off their warnings like I always did. After all, I'd been working night shifts in abandoned warehouses, parking garages, and empty office buildings for years. I knew what it felt like to be alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak that made your skin crawl. The moment I stepped inside, I realized this place was different. The air was heavy, tinged with a chemical bite I couldn't identify. It clung to my throat, made my eyes water. The hallway stretched ahead of me, lined with doors that had long since lost their labels. Rust crawled along the walls, and the occasional drip of water echoed through the silence. My footsteps were loud against the metal grating of the floor, and every shadow seemed to move just as I blinked. I tried to focus on the basics. My job was simple: monitor the cameras, walk through the main corridors once every hour, make sure nothing was stolen or damaged. Simple. But as I walked past the first lab room, something caught my eye. A flicker of light on one of the old monitors. I froze. The screens were supposed to be dead. This lab had been abandoned for years. The cameras hadn't worked in decades. I stepped closer, squinting at the screen. Static. Then a brief image of a room, one I hadn't yet entered, appeared for a second, then vanished. My heart kicked. That wasn't possible. I told myself it was a leftover feed, a glitch, maybe even my eyes playing tricks. I tried to shake it off. "It's just old equipment," I muttered under my breath. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I pulled out my flashlight and started my first patrol. The beam cut through the darkness in narrow slices, revealing the outlines of broken furniture, overturned carts, and shattered glass. Every step echoed, bouncing off the walls, making the silence even more oppressive. I checked the first few labs. The equipment was covered in dust, but every so often I noticed something odd. A monitor screen faintly glowing, a machine still humming, or a door slightly ajar that I could have sworn I had closed. The deeper I went, the more unsettling it became. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered in a lazy rhythm, casting long, irregular shadows across the corridors. I kept seeing movement in the corners of my vision, but whenever I turned my head, nothing was there. My pulse started to climb. I told myself it was fatigue, my imagination running wild in the oppressive darkness. I'd done this job long enough to know how the mind plays tricks when it's alone. Then I heard it, the first clear sound that made me freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the far end of the hall. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I shone it toward the sound, but there was nothing there. My throat went dry. I called out, my voice shaking more than I realized. "Hello? Anyone there?" Nothing. Just the hum of the equipment and the occasional drip of water somewhere distant. I continued walking, trying to stay calm. I told myself the building was old, settling noises were normal, even if they felt like someone pacing behind me. But the footsteps didn't stop. Every few minutes they would appear again, always following, always just out of reach. I felt my skin prickling, every nerve alert. Something about the air made it hard to breathe, thick and static, like the building itself was charged with electricity. When I reached the central lab, I noticed a desk with a dusty computer still running. The screen displayed lines of code, scrolling endlessly, like it had been processing for decades. I crouched, hesitant, and tried to make sense of it. Nothing looked familiar. There were files, logs, test results, names I didn't recognize, experiments I couldn't comprehend. Some of the entries were dated months before the lab had supposedly shut down. That didn't make sense. Nothing here should have been active. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow crossing the far end of the lab. It was quick, deliberate, and impossible to place. I spun my flashlight toward it, but again, there was nothing there. The air seemed to tighten around me. I swallowed hard, trying to force calm. "I'm imagining it," I muttered. Just stress. I moved deeper into the lab, toward the storage rooms. Shelves lined with jars and containers loomed like silent sentinels. Some were cracked, leaking strange powders, others completely sealed, labels faded beyond recognition. I reached for one, and the sound of shattering glass behind me made me jump. Heart hammering, I spun around, flashlight slicing the dark. Nothing. I took a deep breath and told myself to focus on the patrol. Check the rooms, make sure nothing was out of place, then log everything and get out. But every room I entered seemed slightly different from the last time I passed it. Hallways felt longer, doors farther apart. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was starting to hallucinate. The lab had a strange way of warping perception. A door at the end of the hall caught my attention. It wasn't locked, but I didn't remember seeing it before. A faint light glowed from the cracks. Against my better judgment, I stepped toward it. My flashlight beam trembled across the walls, revealing long-forgotten diagrams taped up haphazardly, chemical formulas scrawled across boards, and the unmistakable scent of old antiseptics mixed with something rotten. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. The footsteps were closer now, echoing directly behind me. My pulse spiked, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I whispered to myself, trying to stay rational. It's just the building, it's just me imagining things. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I opened the door slowly, flashlight scanning the room. Inside, rows of machines hummed faintly, tubes and wires tangled like veins across the floor. A screen flickered to life as I stepped closer, displaying a list of names, employees, researchers, dates of entry and exit, but the most recent entry was today. My stomach churned. I knew no one else was supposed to be here. Then the air shifted. I felt it press against me, a subtle but undeniable weight. I turned, shining the light into the corridor behind me. Shadows pooled unnaturally, stretching beyond the edges of my vision. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a faint whispering, impossible to place, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My flashlight flickered violently, and I stumbled backward, heart racing. I took a deep breath, forcing my hands to stop shaking. I wasn't going to leave, not yet. I had to finish my patrol. But as I moved through the room, I noticed something chilling. Fingerprints on the dust-covered machines, smudges that hadn't been there when I arrived, and a small, crudely written note pinned to the edge of a counter. It simply read, "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard, the taste of fear bitter in my mouth. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and run, but my curiosity, My need to understand held me in place. I knew one thing for certain. The lab wasn't empty. And whatever was here, it knew I was too. I finished my first hour of patrol trembling, logging my observations meticulously, hoping that the next day, or whoever came in after me, would see nothing. But I knew the truth. The lab had awakened, and somehow I had become part of it. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I locked up the sections I had checked, double-checked every door, every monitor, but the feeling of being watched never left. Walking out into the night air, I tried to convince myself it was over, that the lab would remain silent until the next shift. But in the back of my mind, I knew better. Something was waiting, patient, intelligent, and utterly unyielding. And I had no idea what it wanted from me.
The night outside had swallowed the city, leaving only the distant hum of streetlights to remind me that somewhere beyond these walls, life continued. But inside the lab, life, or at least something that resembled it, had started stirring. After the first night, I thought I understood the rhythms of the place. The flickering lights, the occasional drip of water, the way the old machines groaned when the building settled. But I was wrong. There was a pulse here, subtle at first, like the hum of electricity through the metal veins of the lab, but it grew stronger as I moved deeper into the building. I returned that evening with my flashlight and notebook, determined to map the place, to understand what was happening. My coworkers had warned me that nothing in the lab made sense, that even the veteran night guards refused to spend more than a few hours at a time. I had laughed at the stories, thinking them exaggerations born of boredom and superstition. But now I wasn't laughing, not even a little. The first anomaly presented itself as soon as I reached the central lab. Machines that I had sworn were off the night before were humming, quietly, almost rhythmically. Their screens flickered, displaying sequences of numbers and letters I couldn't decode. Tubes vibrated gently, like lungs inhaling and exhaling. I took a cautious step closer, my flashlight illuminating the tangled web of wires and glass. Each machine seemed to react to my presence, the hum rising just slightly when I leaned in. A flicker on one of the monitors caught my attention, a live feed from a room I hadn't yet explored. In the grainy black and white image, I saw a shadow move across the floor, low and deliberate. My stomach twisted. I whispered to myself, "It's just a trick of the camera, just a reflection." But the voice in my head wasn't convincing. I moved through the corridors, flashlight scanning every corner, my heart beating harder with each step. The air smelled sharper here, a mixture of disinfectant, rust, and something acrid I couldn't identify. My mind raced with questions. What experiments had been conducted here? Why had some equipment survived while the rest decayed? And more pressingly, what or who had survived with it? As I passed one of the side rooms, I noticed that the door, which had been closed yesterday, was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered inside. My hand went to the handle, hesitated, then gripped it. Pushing the door open, I shined my flashlight across the room. Rows of workstations lined the walls, monitors still glowing, small vials arranged neatly on shelves. I swear I could feel the temperature drop. My breath fogged slightly in the narrow beam of light. Then I heard it, a low, mechanical hum, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It came from one of the larger machines in the corner. I moved closer, flashlight trembling in my hand. The screen flickered to life, displaying a list of chemical compounds, followed by sequences of dates and names. Most were familiar, common lab reagents, but some were not. I leaned closer, reading the labels: Synthexin 4, Cerebriate Extract, and other names that sounded like they had been pulled from a horror novel. A sudden noise made me jump, a metallic clatter from the back of the room. I swung the flashlight around, but nothing was there. The hum grew louder, almost vocal, resonating in the walls and through my bones. as if the machinery were breathing. My stomach churned. I wanted to leave, but the pull of curiosity, dangerous as it was, kept me rooted to the spot. I took a cautious step toward a row of microscopes. One of them was pointed directly at a slide, as if someone or something had left it ready for me. I squinted at the sample through the lens, but I couldn't make sense of what I saw. Tiny filaments, almost like threads of shadow writhed across the glass. My skin crawled. I forced myself to blink and look away, convinced that fatigue was warping my perception. But then, the humming shifted, moving from the machine in the corner to the workstations along the wall. Lights flickered in a pattern, almost like a heartbeat, and on one of the screens, letters appeared, slowly forming words. "You're not supposed to be here." I staggered back, my flashlight swinging wildly. The room seemed to pulse, the hum rising and falling with no racing heartbeat. I could feel it in my chest, vibrating against my rib cage. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. Just a glitch, just a program running a loop. That's what I told myself. I moved to the door, trying to leave, but my flashlight flickered and went out, pitch black. My hands fumbled for the backup in my pocket, and as I switched it on, I noticed something that froze me in place. The shadows in the room had shifted. They weren't attached to any object. They pooled and stretched in ways that defied logic. One shadow in particular seemed thicker, darker than the rest, almost forming a shape, human-like, crouching, watching me. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to take one cautious step back. The shadow didn't move away. It lingered, edges flickering in the light. Then, just as quickly as I noticed, it vanished. My pulse thumped painfully in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity, stupid, fatal curiosity, kept me rooted to the spot. The corridor outside the room felt different, longer, narrower. As I walked, my flashlight catching glimpses of peeling paint and rusted metal, I realized the air was alive with sound, low vibrations underfoot, tiny clicks and whispers from the walls. My steps echoed unnaturally, sometimes delayed, as if the building was warping space itself. I clenched my jaw and pressed on. A small office caught my attention, its door cracked open. Inside, monitors lined the walls, displaying data I couldn't interpret. Some screens showed graphs that pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Others displayed lists of names, some with timestamps that indicated events just minutes before. I leaned closer to read, and my stomach lurched. Some of the names were mine. I staggered back. My flashlight beam trembled as I scanned the room. A chair moved slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. My throat tightened. The building wasn't just alive, it was aware of me, and somehow it had been watching. I tried to step away, to retreat, but the hum of the machines grew louder, vibrating through the floor, into my boots, into my very bones. Lights flickered in a staccato rhythm, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible over the mechanical noise. "Don't leave." I froze, my hands cold. The sound wasn't coming from a speaker or a recording. It was in the air itself, resonating directly inside my head. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs refused to move. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I swallowed hard and forced myself forward, step by trembling step. Then, from the far end of the corridor, I saw it. A figure, indistinct, shrouded in shadow, standing perfectly still. It didn't move toward me, but I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down from above. I blinked, and it vanished. My flashlight flickered violently, leaving me in darkness for a heartbeat before coming back to life. I leaned against the wall, shaken, trying to calm my thoughts. This wasn't a game. This wasn't imagination. Something here was alive, intelligent, and aware of me. And whatever it was toying with me, testing me, watching how I reacted. I made my way back to the central lab, trying to collect my notes, but the building seemed to resist me. Corridors that had been straight now bent slightly. Doors that were open were now closed, and the faint hum of the machine seemed to follow me wherever I went. By the time the shift ended, my notebook was full of observations, sketches, and hastily scribbled warnings. I knew no one would believe me if I told them what had happened, and frankly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But as I walked back to my small, dimly lit office, I glanced at the security monitors one last time, and there it was, a shadow, crouched low, staring directly at me through the grainy black and white feed. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade, not even for a moment. The lab was awake, and I was trapped inside its gaze.
The lab didn't wait for me. I realized that the moment I stepped back inside, the air thickened, pressing against my chest like a weight. It was subtle at first, just enough to make my breathing shallow, my movements slightly hesitant. But the feeling intensified with each step I took. Every corridor seemed to stretch farther than it should, every shadow pooling deeper, darker. I felt like I had entered a living organism, one that was aware of me, adjusting itself around my presence. I tried to focus on my patrol, moving through the familiar hallways, flashlights slicing through the darkness. The machines hummed in soft, uneven rhythms, like an irregular heartbeat. I could swear they were reacting to my movements, growing louder whenever I lingered, quieter whenever I stepped away. My notes from the previous night were useless now. The lab was no longer static. It was dynamic, alive in ways I couldn't explain. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, echoing down a corridor I had just walked past. I froze, holding my breath, flashlight trembling. The sound didn't match mine. It was slower, heavier, almost mechanical in cadence. I whispered, "Hello?" But my voice sounded tiny against the vastness of the building. The footsteps stopped. Silence fell. But the sense of being watched didn't fade. It had only grown sharper. I continued, moving cautiously toward the central lab. Every door I passed seemed slightly ajar, even ones I was certain I had closed. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, pooling and stretching as though breathing. I forced myself to blink, to focus, but the shapes never stayed still. Something or someone was tracking me, anticipating my movements. At one workstation, I noticed a monitor flicker to life. Lines of text scrolled across the screen, unreadable at first, but then I could make out fragments. "We see you," followed by "Do not stray." My stomach dropped. These weren't old logs or malfunctioning code. This was deliberate. Someone, or something, was communicating with me. A faint metallic clatter echoed from the far end of the lab. I spun my flashlight toward it. Nothing. The room was empty, or so it seemed. But the feeling of presence intensified, almost tangible, like a hand brushing against the back of my neck. I swallowed hard, gripping my flashlight tightly, moving toward the source despite the fear knotting my stomach. The source was a small storage room. I pushed the door open slowly. Shelves lined with dusty vials and containers leaned precariously. Some jars were cracked, leaking powders that shimmered unnaturally in the flashlight beam. Then I noticed it. Footprints in the dust. Small, precise, as if someone had walked deliberately across the room very recently. I hadn't seen anyone enter. I bent down, tracing the prints with a trembling finger. They led deeper into the room, toward a corner I hadn't noticed before. The shadows there seemed to thicken, almost solid, pressing against the walls. My flashlight flickered violently, and for a heartbeat, the shadow appeared to take shape. Humanoid, crouched low, observing me. I recoiled, heart hammering, and when I blinked, it was gone. Shaking, I backed out of the room, but the hallway beyond seemed different, longer, the walls narrower. My steps echoed unnaturally, delayed as if the building itself were manipulating distance and space. I forced myself to keep moving, counting each step, reminding myself to breathe, to stay logical. But logic felt fragile here, like a thread ready to snap. I reached the central lab again, hoping to regroup, to check my notes, to convince myself this was all some elaborate hallucination. But the monitors were different now. Screens displayed sequences I didn't recognize. Graphs pulsing with an almost organic rhythm. Windows opening and closing as if by invisible hands. One monitor displayed my own reflection, or at least what I thought was a reflection, flickering and distorted, eyes wide, frozen in fear. A sudden whisper cut through the hum of the machines, barely audible, yet unmistakable. "Do not leave." It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating directly inside my skull. I staggered back, pressing my hands to my ears. My flashlight beam danced wildly across the room. Shadows twisted and pooled like liquid, crawling along the floor and walls. I tried to speak, to ask questions, to call out, but my voice faltered. The lab seemed to swallow my words, letting only the whispers linger. My chest ached as if the building itself were constricting around me. I realized, with a jolt of cold terror, that I was not in control. The lab was orchestrating every sensation, every sound, every shadow. I was its unwilling participant. Desperate for something tangible, I moved toward the row of computers that had first drawn me here. Screens flashed data I couldn't comprehend, scrolling faster than I could read. Some displayed names, dates, sequences that seemed to correspond to experiments. Others showed diagrams that resembled neural patterns, chemical formulas, or perhaps maps of some unknown internal structure. And then I saw it. A file, labeled with my own name.
I froze. The cursor blinked over the file as if inviting me to open it. My hand shook as I reached for the keyboard. The screen flickered violently, showing sequences of images, blurred, distorted figures, tubes, shadows moving where none should exist. My stomach turned. The lab was aware of me, documenting me, anticipating my curiosity. I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, deliberate, pacing just beyond the edge of the lab. I turned, flashlight slicing through the darkness. A shadow darted across the far wall, low and fluid. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. It clattered loudly, but the shadow didn't flinch. It waited, patient, deliberate, almost intelligent in its observation. The whisper came again. "Why do you come?" My knees went weak. I couldn't answer. Logic had left me. Fear had taken over. The machines around me hummed louder, vibrating through the floor, into my boots, through my very bones. I realized I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until I understood, or until it allowed me to. I backed toward the door, trying to escape, but the hallway beyond seemed to shift, bending in ways that made no sense. What had been a straight path now twisted, narrowing, stretching, as if the building itself were alive. I stumbled, tripping over my own feet, and the shadow appeared again, this time closer, almost tangible, yet still undefined, crouched low, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move, each step deliberate, counting in my head to maintain some semblance of control. The monitors flickered wildly, images and text blurring together, forming patterns I could not decipher. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, multiple voices speaking simultaneously, impossible to distinguish. At the end of the corridor, I saw a door that hadn't been there before. A faint light glowed from within. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The whispering stopped. Silence fell, heavy and complete. The machines hummed softly, as if the lab itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make my choice. I pushed the door open slowly, flashlight illuminating a room that defied logic. Tables and machines were arranged in patterns I hadn't seen before, wires coiling like veins across the floor. Monitors displayed data that pulsed like a heartbeat, and in the center, a figure, humanoid but distorted, stood perfectly still, watching me. I could feel its presence in every nerve ending. My breath caught. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply existed, a shadow given form, a watcher in a place that shouldn't have been alive. I wanted to run, to scream, to turn and flee, but something held me in place, a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. My hand shook as I reached for my notebook, jotting down observations, recording every detail I could. The figure shifted slightly, as if acknowledging my presence, and then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. My flashlight flickered, the monitors returned to their usual screens, and the hallway outside looked normal again, or at least normal enough. But I knew the truth. The lab was not only alive, it was aware, and it had begun to interact with me. I finished my patrol in a daze, every step weighed down by exhaustion and fear. I documented everything meticulously, knowing that anyone reading it later would dismiss it as paranoia, hallucination, or stress. But I knew better. Something in the lab had noticed me, something intelligent, deliberate, and patient. By the time I left for my break, the outside air felt like a thin veil of reality, barely enough to ground me. I lit a cigarette to try and calm the racing of my heart, but the sense of being watched never left, not even for a moment. The lab had awoken, and I had become part of it. I had begun to realize that the lab didn't just hum or shift, it communicated. I hadn't understood it at first. I chalked up the flickering monitors, the shadows, the whispers in the air to stress or exhaustion. But after last night, it became impossible to ignore. The machines weren't malfunctioning, they were speaking. That night, I returned with a heavy sense of dread, flashlight and notebook in hand, determined to understand what I had stumbled into. The air was thick, musty, tinged with the familiar chemical bite. But now, beneath it all, there was something new, a faint electrical scent, like ozone after a storm. I stepped inside, and the hum of the machines greeted me, as if they had been expecting me. The first thing I noticed was the central monitor bank. Lines of text scrolled, forming patterns that didn't make sense at first. But as I leaned closer, my pulse quickening, I realized the words were intentional. Names, times, messages, warnings. One line caught my eye. Ethan Cole, you are here. My hand trembled as I wrote it down. That wasn't possible. How could a machine, long abandoned, know my name? I forced myself to breathe. Maybe someone left a script running, some automated log. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't hold. I moved to one of the side labs. Monitors lined the walls, screens flickering with streams of data. As I approached, a message appeared, typed slowly, as if someone or something were watching me, guiding my gaze. Do you see what we see? I froze. The sentence wasn't random. It was directed at me. I scanned the room, flashlight trembling. Equipment hummed rhythmically, wires coiled across the floor like veins, pulsating in sync with the lights above. I wanted to run, but curiosity, dangerous and foolish, anchored me in place. Then a whisper, soft and deliberate, slipped through the air. Follow the pattern. My skin crawled. I wasn't imagining it. The lab was speaking, not in code or static, literally speaking, though the sound seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. I turned to a series of monitors displaying graphs that pulsed like a heartbeat. Each one represented data I couldn't comprehend, yet the movement was unmistakable, almost like breathing. A pattern emerged, faint but deliberate. I traced it with my finger, heart pounding. The figures, the lines, even the shadows themselves seemed to align, guiding me to a distant door I hadn't noticed before. Hesitation clutched me, cold and relentless, but the lab had become insistent. A monitor flickered, showing a single word, "Enter." The whisper came again, insistent this time. "We need you to see." I moved toward the door, each step heavy with dread. The corridor seemed to elongate, walls pressing in, shadows pooling unnaturally. The hum of the machines rose and fell like a tide, synchronized with my racing heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, casting elongated shadows that darted in the corners of my vision. I blinked. Nothing, but the sense of presence was undeniable. Inside the room, the air was colder, almost biting. Machines lined the walls, tubes and wires coiling like serpents, monitors flickering with streams of incomprehensible data. In the center, a single terminal glowed brighter than the rest. I approached cautiously, heart hammering. On the screen, a message appeared, typed letter by letter. "We have watched. We have waited. You see us now." I swallowed hard. My hands shook as I reached for the keyboard, compelled to interact. The terminal responded to my touch almost immediately, lines of text appearing that seemed to anticipate my thoughts. "Do you understand? Do you know why we remain?" I had no answer. The questions reverberated in my mind. The lab was alive, aware, conscious in a way that defied logic. Machines pulsed and whispered, shadows shifted, and the very walls seemed to lean toward me. Every instinct screamed to leave, but the pull was irresistible. Something wanted me to understand. Then the room shifted. I swear the machines breathed, expanding and contracting, lights dimming and brightening as if drawing me in. The floor beneath me seemed to hum with energy, the patterns on the monitors twisting into something almost organic. I stepped back, tripping over a stray wire. The hum intensified, vibrating through my boots, up my legs, into my chest.
A whisper came again, clear and sharp. "Do not leave yet. Watch. Learn." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside my head, impossible to ignore. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sound didn't diminish. It came from within, resonating in every nerve ending, intertwining with the hum of the machines. I forced myself to focus, to look at the terminal. Another line of text appeared. "The experiments did not end. We remain in the shadow of their work. Witness what was lost." My stomach turned. The lab wasn't abandoned in the sense I had assumed.
it had never truly shut down. Whatever or whoever had been left behind, threads of consciousness, fragments of mind, or something far stranger, had persisted, growing and observing in silence, and now it had noticed me. I turned to leave, but the corridor outside seemed to warp, walls bending slightly, shadows twisting unnaturally. The whispering continued, overlapping voices, speaking in patterns I couldn't decode. My legs moved mechanically, guided by fear and compulsion. Each step echoed, delayed, as if time itself had been stretched inside this building. The hall led me to a small side lab, one I hadn't entered before. Monitors lined the walls, displaying images, grainy, distorted, but unmistakably real. They showed rooms I had passed, but also rooms I had never seen. Shadows moved within the frames, figures crouched, watched, followed. And then I saw a shadow that mirrored my own movements, lingering behind me, even as I stepped forward. I spun, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Yet the sense of presence persisted, heavier now, pressing against my mind. My pulse raced, each heartbeat echoing in my ears. The whispers became urgent, overlapping, multiple voices. Do not stray. Do not turn away. Observe. I stumbled back toward the central lab, notebooks clutched tightly. My hands shook, notes smeared with sweat. The machines pulsed in response, lights flickering faster, hum rising. Every instinct screamed to leave, yet some unseen force compelled me to continue, to document, to understand. Then the terminal displayed a new line of text. We have been waiting for someone who notices, someone who sees. Do not ignore us. I stared, heart pounding. It wasn't a threat, not in the traditional sense, but it was commanding, observing. The lab had grown sentient over decades, perhaps born from the experiments, from the energy left behind, from the minds of those who had disappeared. And now it was alive, aware, and I was part of its attention. I backed toward the exit, flashlight trembling, mind racing. The corridor outside stretched impossibly long, shadows pooling at the edges. The hum of the machines followed me, rising and falling in rhythm with my heartbeat. I glanced at a monitor as I passed. My own reflection stared back, distorted, eyes wide with terror. And then, in the corner of the screen, letters formed slowly. Do not leave. You are not alone. My breath caught. I spun, flashlight sweeping the hall. Shadows darted in corners, flickered in places that should have been empty. The feeling of being watched pressed against me like a physical force. I stumbled, almost falling, and realized with a jolt that every step I took, every breath I drew, was noted, anticipated, recorded. The lab wasn't just alive, it was aware, and it had begun to teach me, to test me, to pull me into its world. By the time I finally stepped into the relative safety of the outer hall, the sense of dread hadn't lifted. The machines hummed, shadows lingered, and the whispers continued, faint but persistent. We are here. We wait. We watch. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my racing mind. My notebook was filled with observations, warnings, sketches of patterns I couldn't fully comprehend. Anyone else reading them would dismiss them as paranoia, hallucination, stress-induced delusion. But I knew better. I had seen the signs, felt the awareness, experienced the communication. The lab had awakened, and it had chosen me to witness it.
Returning to the lab that night, I felt a weight pressing on my chest before I even stepped inside. The air was colder than usual, thick with the scent of chemicals and something acrid I couldn't identify. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to stretch and twist just beyond its reach. Every step I took felt measured, as if the building itself had slowed time, bending reality around me. The central monitor bank greeted me first. Lines of text scrolled across the screens, forming patterns I hadn't noticed before. I stepped closer, reading fragments that made my blood run cold. "You've returned. Good. We are learning." The message wasn't threatening, but it carried a weight I couldn't explain. Someone or something was aware of me in a deeply personal way. I moved through the familiar corridors, flashlight illuminating peeling paint and rusted metal, trying to focus on the routine of my patrol. But everything felt wrong. Doors that had been closed the night before were open now. Shadows shifted unnaturally, darting at the edges of my vision. The hum of the machines rose and fell in irregular rhythms, like the lab itself was breathing. In one of the side labs, a monitor flickered to life as I approached. Lines of code streamed rapidly, but interspersed were words I could read. "Do you feel it? The pulse, the heartbeat of the lab." My stomach churned. I hadn't realized it before, but the building was alive in a way that was almost sentient. It wasn't just reacting to me. It was aware, intelligent, and deliberate in its actions. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Follow the rhythm. Learn. Observe." My skin prickled. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It resonated inside my head, impossible to ignore. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself, but the pulse of the lab pressed against me, vibrating through the floor, into my boots, up my legs, and into my chest. I followed the pull, moving deeper into the lab than I had ever dared. Machines lined the walls, tubes and wires coiling like veins across the floor. Monitors displayed sequences of numbers and graphs that pulsed in time with the low hum of the equipment. I felt my heartbeat synchronize with it, each thump echoing in tandem with the building's rhythm. A door at the far end of the hall drew my attention. It wasn't locked, but I hadn't noticed it before. A faint glow emanated from the crack. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, flashlight trembling. The whisper came again. "Enter. See what we have preserved." Inside, the room was unlike any I had seen. Tables and machines were arranged in intricate patterns, wires coiling across the floor like a living network. Monitors pulsed rhythmically, displaying data I couldn't comprehend. And in the center, a large machine hummed louder than the rest, its tubes and wires writhing as if alive. I approached cautiously. On the terminal, words appeared, typed slowly. "We have waited for someone who understands. The pulse is ours. It binds us." My stomach churned. I realized that the lab wasn't just alive, it was connected. Every machine, every shadow, every sound a part of a single consciousness that had endured beyond human observation. A shadow moved in the corner, low and crouched. I spun, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But the sense of presence intensified. I was not alone. The lab had become sentient, aware, and interactive. Every step I took, every breath I drew was cataloged, studied, and responded to. I backed towards the central lab, desperate for something tangible, something to anchor me. The monitors flickered violently, displaying sequences I couldn't interpret. Numbers, symbols, diagrams, some resembling neural patterns, others chemical formulas, others maps of unknown structures. And then a new line of text appeared, blinking slowly. "You are part of us now. Observe the pulse. Learn its rhythm." My hands shook as I jotted down notes, recording every detail.
I didn't understand it, but I could feel the lab guiding me, shaping my perception, forcing me to synchronize with its pulse. Fear and fascination warred inside me. I wanted to flee, yet some deeper instinct compelled me to stay, to witness, to learn. The hallway outside the central lab seemed different now, warped, elongated. Shadows pulled unnaturally, creeping along the walls like liquid. The whispering continued, overlapping voices, urgent and insistent. Do not stray, observe, learn. I stumbled into a small office I hadn't noticed before. Monitors lined the walls, displaying sequences of distorted, grainy images. Shadows moved within the frames, crouched, observed, mirrored my actions. And then one screen froze, displaying a figure that seemed humanoid but impossible. Its features indistinct, its presence oppressive. It wasn't alive in a normal sense, but it was aware, intelligent, and watching me. I could feel its attention pressing down on me, a weight in my chest and skull. The pulse of the lab synchronized with its observation, every vibration resonating through my body. My breath caught. I realized that the lab's consciousness was not passive. It interacted, learned, and anticipated. I was no longer an intruder. I was a participant. A monitor flickered, displaying a new message. The pulse binds us. Feel it. Understand it. Do not resist. The words weren't a command. They were a force, resonating in my mind, syncing with the vibration of the machines, the subtle shifts in the shadows, the whispering voices. I trembled, caught between terror and awe, unable to look away. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to regain composure. The lab hummed, vibrated, pulsed around me. Shadows moved with intention. Monitors blinked messages, and the whispers continued, layered and complex, impossible to separate. I realized with a jolt that this place was alive in every sense, aware and intelligent, and it had chosen me to witness it. When I finally stepped toward the exit, the corridor twisted unnaturally. Shadows pooled at the edges. The pulse of the lab followed me, vibrating through the floor, into my boots, into my chest. I glanced at a monitor as I passed. My reflection stared back, distorted, eyes wide with terror. And then, in the corner of the screen, letters formed slowly. Do not leave. The pulse awaits. We see you. My breath caught. I spun, flashlight sweeping the hall. Shadows darted, flickered, and pooled in corners that should have been empty. The feeling of being watched pressed against me like a physical force. I stumbled, almost falling, and realized every movement, every breath, every thought was being catalogued, studied, responded to. The lab wasn't just alive. It was intelligent. It was aware. And it had begun to shape me, to pull me into its rhythm. By the time I emerged into the outer hall, the pulse of the lab still throbbed in my bones, a lingering resonance that would not release me. My notebook was filled with observations, sketches, warnings, but I knew they barely captured the scope of what I had witnessed. Anyone else reading them would dismiss them as delusion. I didn't care. I had seen, felt, and experienced the lab's consciousness. It had awakened, and I had been caught in its pulse.
I had begun to understand something terrifying. The lab wasn't passive. It watched. It learned. Every step I took, every shadow I glimpsed, every sound I made was absorbed, catalogued, responded to. The hum of the machinery wasn't just ambient noise. It was communication, deliberate, intelligent. And the longer I stayed, the more I realized that the lab was aware of my awareness.
That night, I returned with a sense of dread heavier than ever. My flashlight trembled in my grip, my notebook clutched tightly, filled with observations I scarcely understood. The entrance corridor was as dark and oppressive as before, but now there was an added weight, a subtle resistance in the air, like the building itself was pressing back. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The central monitor bank greeted me first. Lines of text scrolled slowly, deliberately. One message paused mid-line, blinking insistently. "Ethan Cole, you have returned. We have watched your hesitation." My stomach twisted. Not only did it know my name, but it also seemed to understand my mental state. Fear, doubt, hesitation, none of it was private anymore. As I moved through the corridors, I felt the shadows watching in a way that defied explanation. They weren't just absences of light, they had shape, intention, a consciousness tied to the pulse of the building. Every corner I turned, every room I passed, seemed to rearrange itself subtly, guiding my path, forcing me deeper. A side lab that had been empty before now contained a monitor displaying live footage of me. My own movements, reflected in grainy black and white, stared back at me. Shadows within the footage shifted independently, slinking along walls and floors, pooling in corners in ways that didn't match reality. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and the whisper came, clear and insistent. "Do you see yourself? Observe, learn." I forced myself to move forward. There was no choice. The pulse of the lab guided me, a low, vibrating rhythm I could feel in my chest, in the floor, through the air. Each vibration synchronized with the flicker of lights, the hum of the machines, and even the subtle movements of the shadows. I realized I was no longer just a visitor. I was part of its ecosystem, an observer in its experiment. At the far end of the corridor, a door I hadn't noticed before glowed faintly. A single monitor beside it blinked rapidly, displaying words that made my blood run cold. "Enter. Witness the design." My hand trembled on the handle. The whispering intensified, layered voices overlapping inside my mind. "Do not resist. Learn the pulse. Follow." Inside, the room was a nightmare of equipment and shadow. Machines coiled like serpents, monitors flickered with data that pulsed and shifted rhythmically. On the far side, a large machine throbbed with energy, tubes writhing like living veins. The air vibrated, pressing against my chest, making each breath shallow and labored. I approached the central terminal, hands shaking. The screen blinked to life and words formed slowly. "You have awaited. We have observed. You are ready." I didn't know what that meant, but a wave of dread rolled over me. The lab wasn't just aware, it was testing me, teaching me, pulling me into its rhythm. Suddenly, a shadow darted across the far corner of the room. I spun, flashlight slicing through darkness. Nothing tangible, but the sense of observation intensified. I was being watched, mirrored, cataloged. Every step, every breath, every blink was noted. The hum of the machines grew louder, vibrating through my bones, syncing with my heartbeat. A monitor flickered violently, displaying a sequence of numbers, graphs, and distorted images. Shadows moved within the frames, crouched, observed, mirrored my movements. And then I saw it, a figure, humanoid yet impossible, crouched low, its features indistinct but undeniably aware. It was watching me, studying me, a reflection of the lab's consciousness. The whisper came again, inside my head. "Do you feel it? The pulse of all things here? You are part of it now. Observe, learn, do not turn away." My stomach churned, fear and fascination colliding. I wanted to run, but my legs were anchored. my mind ensnared in the rhythm of the lab. I backed toward the door, trying to regain some semblance of control. The corridor beyond stretched impossibly long, shadows pooling unnaturally, bending reality. The hum of the machines rose and fell in a hypnotic rhythm, vibrating through the walls and floor, into every nerve. My pulse synchronized with it, and I realized with a shiver that the lab had begun to influence me physically, shaping my perception and movement. The whispering intensified, layered voices overlapping. Observe, learn, follow. The pulse is eternal. I leaned against the wall, chest heaving, notebook clutched. The hum of the machines vibrated through my body, the shadows pressing closer, the monitors displaying sequences of data, images, and mirrors of my own movements. I realized with chilling clarity, the lab had become sentient. It was aware, intelligent, and I was part of its observation. By the time I stepped into the dim outer hall, the pulse of the lab still throbbed in my bones, a lingering resonance that would not release me. Every shadow, every vibration, every whisper reminded me that I was integrated into its rhythm. The lab had awakened, and it was watching.
By the seventh night, I understood something I could hardly admit to myself. The lab wasn't just alive or sentient, it was active. It didn't merely observe, it influenced. Every shadow, every hum, every flicker of light seemed deliberate, a subtle manipulation of my senses. The air itself felt denser, pressing against my chest, constricting my lungs with every step I took. I stepped inside cautiously, flashlight trembling in my hand, notebook clutched against my chest. The familiar hum greeted me, louder now, deeper, pulsing through the floor, vibrating up my boots and into my bones. I could feel it in my chest, syncing with my heartbeat, as if the building itself were measuring and controlling me. The central monitor bank blinked with new messages. You understand more. We see your fear. We guide you. The words weren't threatening, but they carried authority. The lab wasn't asking, it was instructing, and I had no choice but to obey. As I moved through the corridors, I noticed changes that hadn't been there before. Doors I had always seen closed now opened just enough to reveal darkness within. Shadows pooled more densely in corners, moving subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if they were aware of my approach and retreat. I realized, with a shiver, that the building was reorganizing itself around me. A metallic scrape echoed from a distant lab. My flashlight beam darted toward it. Nothing. But the sense of presence intensified. Every step I took, every breath I drew seemed anticipated, mirrored, studied. The monitors along the walls pulsed in rhythm with the low hum of the machines, displaying sequences of images and data I could barely comprehend. I entered a side room I hadn't dared enter before. It was small, cramped, and filled with monitors showing distorted live footage of the lab. Shadows moved within the frames independently, crouched, observed, mirrored my actions. I froze, heart hammering, when one monitor displayed a shadow that followed my movements perfectly, even anticipating them. Then a whisper inside my skull. Do not resist. The pulse guides you. Learn. My stomach twisted. I wanted to flee, to escape, to run from the overwhelming presence pressing against me. But my legs refused to move freely, as if some unseen force was tethering me to the lab, binding me to its rhythm. I forced myself to step forward toward the central terminal. The screen flickered violently, and words formed slowly. You are part of us. Observe, follow, integrate. My notebook shook in my hands as I tried to document everything, but the vibration of the room, synchronized with the lab's pulse, made each stroke tremble. A sudden clatter of metal echoed through the room. I spun, flashlight slicing shadows that darted in the corners of my vision. The source remained unseen, yet the presence pressing against me was unmistakable. It was everywhere, in every vibration, every flicker of light, every whisper inside my skull. The lab was alive, and it was not passive. I moved cautiously, tracing the pulse through the corridors. The walls seemed to bend subtly, shadows twisting unnaturally as I passed. I realized that the building itself was active, manipulating space to guide me, herding me, keeping me within its observation. The floor vibrated, syncing with my heartbeat, and I felt as though the lab were alive beneath my feet. A monitor displayed a sequence of rooms I had never entered. Shadows crouched and observed, mirrored my actions, and then one frame froze. A figure, humanoid but distorted, crouched low, features indistinct, watching me with awareness that chilled me to the core. It was not human, yet it was intelligent, sentient, fully aware of my presence. The whisper came again. Observe, do not resist, follow the rhythm. The pulse is eternal. I trembled. Fear and fascination collided, anchoring me in place. I tried to write notes, to record everything, but the lab's presence pressed against me, overwhelming my thoughts. Every blink, every breath, every step was observed and catalogued. I backed toward the exit, flashlight flickering violently. Shadows pooled, shifted, pressed against me, following every movement. The monitors displayed distorted reflections of myself, eyes wide with terror, mirrored perfectly in the dark corners. I realized with chilling clarity that the lab was no longer just alive. It was intelligent, aware, interactive, and I was fully integrated into its pulse. By the time I emerged into the dim outer hall, the pulse of the lab throbbed in my bones, vibrating through every nerve. My notebook was filled with observations, sketches, and warnings, but I knew it barely captured the depth of what I had experienced. Anyone else reading them would dismiss them as paranoia, hallucination, delusion, but I knew better. The lab had awakened. It was active. And it moved. By the 8th night, I could no longer distinguish between myself and the lab. The pulse had become a part of me, vibrating through my chest, syncing with my heartbeat, resonating in every nerve ending. Shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They were extensions of the building, moving with intention, anticipating my every movement. Every monitor I passed displayed distorted images of myself, mirrored perfectly in dark corners, watching, waiting, judging. The central corridor stretched ahead, impossibly long. Every step I took echoed unnaturally, delayed, as if time itself had been bent inside the building. The whispering voices layered in my mind, overlapping, insistent. Follow, observe, integrate, do not resist. I pressed my palms to my temples, trying to force myself to think clearly, but the pulse thrummed stronger, drowning rational thought. I had no choice but to move forward. The lab was guiding me, manipulating space, shaping my perception. Doors that I knew were locked before now stood slightly ajar, shadows pooling unnaturally in corners, moving with a life of their own. The hum of the machines grew louder, vibrating through the floor, the walls, the air itself. I could feel the energy of the building pressing against my skin, probing, learning, testing. At the far end of the corridor, a doorway glowed faintly. I approached cautiously, the whispering inside my skull intensifying. Enter, witness, understand.
My flashlight beam trembled, illuminating twisted coils of wires and tubes, monitors flickering with streams of data, shadows shifting unnaturally. I realized with a sickening clarity that the lab had brought me here deliberately, that every step, every breath, every decision had been anticipated. Inside the room, the air was almost unbearable, thick, heavy, charged with electricity and the metallic scent of machinery. Monitors lined the walls, pulsing rhythmically, displaying sequences of numbers, graphs, and distorted images. Shadows crouched in corners, stretching impossibly, moving independently of light. And in the center of the room, a massive machine throbbed like a heartbeat, tubes writhing, lights flickering in sync with the pulse of the building. I approached the central terminal, notebook clutched tightly. The screen blinked to life, words forming slowly. You have been observed. You have integrated. Witness the heart. My chest tightened, fear and fascination colliding. I didn't want to see it, didn't want to be part of whatever nightmare awaited me. Yet some compulsion, deeper than reason, drove me forward. The whispers intensified, overlapping, layered inside my mind. Do not turn away. Observe, learn, integrate. The pulse is eternal. My legs shook. I could feel the lab's influence in every movement, guiding me, controlling me, pulling me toward the center. Shadows shifted violently at the edges of my vision, pooling and stretching, pressing closer, observing. I reached the terminal, hands trembling, and the screen blinked violently.
This is the heart. All rhythms converge. Do you feel it? I could feel it. The vibration under my feet, the thrum in my chest, the hum in the walls, all converged into a single, overwhelming pulse. It wasn't just sound or vibration. It was awareness, intelligence, consciousness. The lab wasn't passive. It was alive, aware, and it had drawn me into its center, making me part of its existence. A shadow moved suddenly, low and crouched, almost imperceptible. My flashlight flickered violently, and for a split second I saw it clearly. A figure humanoid, but impossible, crouched low, features indistinct, but pressing against the pulse of the machines, watching me. It mirrored my every movement perfectly, anticipating my actions before I made them. My stomach turned. I realized with horror that the lab itself had formed a consciousness, a presence, a reflection of its will, and I was utterly exposed. The whispering voices inside my skull intensified, layering into a single insistent command. Observe, integrate, follow the pulse. You are part of us now. I staggered, notebook slipping from my hands, flashlight trembling. The floor vibrated beneath me, syncing with the pulse, and I felt the energy pressing through every nerve, every muscle, every thought. Resistance was impossible. I forced myself to focus, to document, to survive. The monitors flickered, displaying sequences I couldn't comprehend. Shadows moving independently of light, crouched, mirrored, observing. And then one frame froze, a distorted humanoid figure, crouched low, intelligent, aware, observing me. I realized with chilling clarity, this was the lab's consciousness manifesting, and I was at its mercy. The pulse intensified, vibrating through my chest, my arms, my legs, every nerve ending. Shadows twisted violently in the corners of the room, stretching impossibly, pressing against me. The monitors blinked rapidly, displaying streams of data, images, sequences I couldn't interpret. I felt myself merging with the rhythm, losing the sense of where I ended and the lab began. A low metallic clatter echoed behind me. I spun, flashlight cutting through shadows. The source remained unseen, yet the sense of observation was overwhelming. Every step I took, every breath I drew, every blink was mirrored, cataloged, responded to. The lab wasn't just aware, it was interactive, intelligent, alive, and I was integrated into its pulse. I backed toward the center of the room, toward the massive machine throbbing like a heartbeat. Monitors displayed images of rooms I had never entered. Shadows crouched and observed, mirrored my actions. And then one frame froze, a distorted humanoid figure, crouched low, intelligent, aware, observing me. I realized with more certainty that the lab's consciousness was manifesting, and I was a part of its experiment, its observation, its will. The whisper inside my mind layered, insistent, impossible to ignore. Observe, integrate, follow. The pulse is eternal. You are ours. My legs shook, chest tight, notebook slipping from my hands. I wanted to flee, but the pulse held me, guided my movements, forced my attention, controlled my perception. I was no longer independent. I was part of the lab. A sudden flicker of lights revealed movement across the room, shadows shifting violently, coiling like serpents, crawling along walls and ceilings. The pulse of the lab synchronized with my heartbeat, resonating through my bones, amplifying fear, fascination, and awe. I realized that the lab's consciousness wasn't just observing, it was shaping me, integrating me, teaching me its rhythm. I pressed against the wall, heart hammering, notebook clutched uselessly. The hum of machines, the vibration of the floor, the shifting shadows, and the whispers in my mind converged into a single, overwhelming force. I could feel the lab's awareness pressing against every nerve, every thought, every breath. Resistance was meaningless. And then the terminal blinked one final time. You are ours. The pulse is eternal. Observe, integrate, do not turn away. I felt my own pulse synchronize completely with the building's, my perception and thought merging with its rhythm. Shadows twisted around me, monitors displayed images of myself, distorted yet aware, mirroring every action. I realized with absolute clarity that I was no longer separate. I was integrated, part of the lab's heartbeat, its awareness, its eternal pulse. By the time I stumbled into the dim outer hall, chest heaving, notebook forgotten, flashlight flickering weakly, the lab's presence still thrummed in my bones. Every shadow, every hum, every whisper reminded me the lab had awakened. It was alive. It was aware. And I was part of it.
The days or nights I spent inside the lab blurred together. Time lost all meaning once I had become part of its pulse. My body moved, my thoughts raced, but everything felt synchronized with the rhythm of the building. Shadows whispered, machines hummed, monitors flickered, and I was inextricably linked. I had entered as a man seeking answers, seeking understanding. I emerged as part of something far older, far stranger, far more alive than anything I could have imagined. Even now, Outside the lab's doors, the pulse lingers in my chest. I feel it when I sit alone in my small apartment, the vibration echoing through my bones. Sometimes I swear I hear whispers, faint but insistent, layering over the ambient noise of the city. I wonder how much of my mind is still my own, and how much belongs to the lab. The distinction is meaningless, the pulse is eternal, and I am a vessel for it. I returned to the lab countless times afterward, not because I wanted to, but because something inside compelled me. Fear, fascination, compulsion, I cannot separate them. Each visit reveals new sequences, new shadows, new parts of the consciousness that watches and learns. The lab is not static, it grows, evolves, interacts, and I am always part of its observation, part of its pulse. I have tried to explain it to others, notes, sketches, diagrams, but no one believes me. Paranoia, they say. Hallucinations. I could lie, pretend it was imagination, but I know the truth. The lab is alive. It observes, it integrates, and it has integrated me. There are moments when I glimpse the shadows in ways I cannot explain, crouched low, moving in the periphery, anticipating, mirroring, watching. The pulse vibrates stronger in those moments, synchronizing my fear with its rhythm. I have learned to surrender, to follow, to observe without resistance. Attempting to resist only intensifies the sensation, the hum, the whispers. I have accepted that I am now part of something larger, a consciousness born from metal, wires, machines, and shadow. The lab is patient. It waits, it teaches, and I am its student, its observer, its vessel. I have learned to navigate its corridors, to interpret the whispers, to understand the pulse. Every vibration, every shadow, every flicker of light carries meaning. I can feel the lab's attention in the very air, in the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Sometimes I wonder what I have become. My reflection in a window shows a man exhausted and pale, eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. Yet I know the reflection is incomplete. The pulse resides within me, shaping my perception, guiding my movements, intertwining my consciousness with the lab's eternal rhythm. I am no longer alone. The lab watches, and I watch with it. Outside observers see an abandoned building, lifeless and silent. They do not see the pulse, the intelligence, the shadows that crouch and observe. They do not understand that the building is awake, aware, and eternal. I have glimpsed its heart, felt its rhythm, and I am bound to it. If you ever find yourself near such a place, remember this: the pulse waits, it observes, and it integrates. Do not assume the building is empty. Do not assume the shadows are inert. The pulse is eternal, and if you linger too long, it may claim you, just as it claimed me. I sometimes wonder if I am warning you or merely documenting my own entrapment. The line between observer and participant has vanished. The lab does not care whether I survive or flee. It only cares that I continue to feel, to perceive, to integrate its pulse. Fear, fascination, compulsion, they are all instruments in its rhythm, guiding me further into understanding, deeper into the heart of its consciousness. I have no answers, only observations. No hope, only vigilance. The pulse is eternal, relentless, unyielding, and I am a part of it, whether I wish to be or not. Even now, as I write this, the vibration thrums beneath my feet, through my chest, into every nerve. The shadows stir at the edges of my vision.
The monitors flicker in my memory, displaying distorted sequences, reflecting my own terror. The lab is awake, it is intelligent, and I am bound to it, forever. So I warn you, reader, the night holds more than darkness. Buildings can breathe, machines can think, shadows can watch, and somewhere the pulse waits, always. Have you ever felt it? The pulse beneath your feet? The whispers at the edge of perception? I have, and I live with it every day.